an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Marianne Elcott's fingers trembled as she stood in the candlelit bridal chamber, surrounded by scattered rose petals that seemed to mock her practical marriage to Baron Hugh Redstone. Her new husband's reflection appeared in the mirror behind her, tall and imposing, his face a careful mask as he began unbuttoning his shirt. The air between them crackled with unspoken expectations, while the winter wind rattled the windows of Redstone Hall. Hugh's eyes met hers in the glass, revealing a flicker of something unexpected. Not desire, not coldness, but a hesitation that made Marianne's breath catch. She turned, prepared to fulfill her duty as his new baroness, when his hand suddenly stilled on his half-opened shirt, and in one quiet motion, he reached not for her, but for the blanket to sweep away the romantic pretense scattered across their marriage bed. The whispers followed Marianne Elcott through the corridors of Redstone Hall like persistent shadows. 6 years, as governess had taught her to move with quiet dignity past servants, whose conversations faltered at her approach. Today, those whispers carried a new urgency that made her spine stiffen beneath her modest gray dress. Too familiar with the master, they said. Always in his study after the children are abed. At 35, Marianne understood her precarious position. A governess existed in that uncomfortable space between servant and gentlewoman. Too educated to be below stairs, yet never quite accepted above them. One hint of impropriety could render her unemployable throughout the county. She paused by the window, overlooking the frost-covered gardens. Baron Hugh Redstone stood near the stables, his tall figure unmistakable, even at a distance. The December light caught his profile, sharp and severe as the winter landscape. The servants called him cold. The villagers spoke of how he'd changed since Lady Redstone's death 3 years ago. Marianne knew better. She had witnessed his hands trembling as he straightened his daughter's bed covers, had seen the careful way he preserved every drawing they presented him. Cold was too simple a word for a man who carried such careful silence. Miss Elcott. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, appeared at her elbow. The Baron requests your presence in his study immediately. Marianne nodded, smoothing her dress. The summons was not unusual. Weekly discussions about the children's progress had been their routine for years. Yet something in Mrs. Winters' expression suggested this meeting would be different. The Baron's study smelled of leather and wood smoke. Hugh stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, staring into the fire. You wish to see me, my lord? Marianne kept her voice level, professional. He turned, and she was struck anew by the controlled precision of his movements. At 42, Hugh Redstone remained a handsome man, though grief had carved lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she'd first arrived. Miss Elcott. His voice was deep, measured. I've received a letter from my aunt in London. She mentions concerns. Marianne's throat tightened. Concerns, my lord. About the nature of our association. He met her eyes directly. It seems our discussions about the children have been misconstrued by certain observers. Heat rose to Marianne's cheeks. I assure you, my lord, he raised a hand, your conduct has been beyond reproach. It is the perception that concerns me, for your sake, as much as for mine and my daughter's. The implication hung in the air between them. A governess tainted by scandal would find no place in another household. I understand. She clasped her hands to hide their trembling. I shall begin searching for a new position immediately. That is not what I'm proposing. Hugh moved to his desk, his expression unreadable. My daughters need stability. They've grown attached to you. To remove you now would cause them distress. Marianne waited, uncertain. I believe there is a practical solution. He spoke as if discussing estate matters. Marriage would silence the rumors and provide you with security. It would give my daughters the maternal guidance they require. Marianne stared, certain she had misheard. Marriage, my lord. A marriage of convenience, he clarified. I do not expect. That is to say, your duties would remain largely educational, but you would have the protection of my name and position. The practical part of Marianne's mind recognized the logic. The woman who had once dreamed of love recognized the absence of it in his proposal. And if I refuse, she asked quietly. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps. Then I would provide references and a generous severance, but the children would suffer. In that moment, Marianne understood her choice was no choice at all. The girls needed her, and she, with no family and few prospects, needed this position. Very well, she said. I accept your proposal. Hugh nodded, as if concluding a business transaction. We shall be married on Saturday. The wedding of Baron Hugh Redstone to Miss Marianne Elcott took place in the small stone church of St. Michael's on a crisp December morning. No banns had been read. A special license had been procured with the efficiency that characterized all the Baron's dealings. The ceremony lasted precisely 20 minutes, with only the required witnesses present: the Baron's solicitor, the housekeeper Mrs. Winters, and the two solemn-faced Redstone daughters. Marianne wore her best dress, a dove-gray silk that had been hastily altered by the village seamstress. No veil covered her face. No orange blossoms adorned her carefully pinned hair. She spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice that betrayed none of the tumult beneath her composed exterior. I now pronounce you man and wife. The vicar's words echoed in the nearly empty church. Hugh turned to her, his face impassive, and brushed his lips against her cheek. A gesture so brief it might have been imagined. His daughters watched with wide, uncertain eyes. Are you our mother now? 8-year-old Catherine asked as they walked back to the waiting carriage. I'm your stepmother, Marianne replied carefully. But I shall always be your teacher as well. 6-year-old Eleanor slipped her small hand into Marianne's. Will you still read to us before bed? Of course I will. Marianne squeezed the little hand, grateful for this one constant in the shifting landscape of her life. The return to Redstone Hall felt surreal. Marianne had left that morning as the governess. She returned as its mistress. The staff had assembled in the entrance hall, their faces a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and in a few cases, barely concealed disapproval. May I present the new Lady Redstone? Hugh announced formally. Marianne nodded to them, acutely aware of her gray dress and the absence of jewels that might have marked her new station. She caught the cook whispering to a housemaid, whose eyes widened in response. Your quarters have been moved to the east wing, Mrs. Winters informed her, with just enough emphasis on your to make it clear these would be separate from the Baron's. Thank you, Mrs. Winters. Marianne maintained her composure, though her cheeks burned. I should like to see the children settled for their afternoon lessons. Surely not today, my lady, the housekeeper replied. It is your wedding day, after all. Before Marianne could respond, Hugh intervened. Lady Redstone may arrange her schedule as she sees fit, Mrs. Winters. The children's education remains her priority. His support, however formal, steadied her. This, at least, had not changed. Their shared concern for Catherine and Eleanor. Later, as Marianne supervised the girls' arithmetic in what had been her schoolroom just that morning, she caught Catherine studying her with a thoughtful expression. Is something troubling you, Catherine? She asked. The girl hesitated. Will you be different now that you're married to father? The directness of the question caught Marianne off guard. In some ways, things will change, she admitted, but my care for you and Eleanor will remain exactly the same. Catherine nodded, seemingly satisfied, and returned to her sums. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Marianne sat at the opposite end of the long table from Hugh, a distance that seemed to symbolize their arrangement. The Baron ate methodically, occasionally asking about the children's progress or estate matters, but offering nothing of himself. The blue drawing room has been prepared for you in the evenings, he told her as they finished. I typically work in my study until late. You need not wait up. I understand. Marianne folded her napkin precisely, and the children's routine should continue as before. Hugh paused, then added, though perhaps you might join me for breakfast at 8. There are household matters we should discuss regularly. It was, Marianne realized, his attempt at accommodation, creating space for her new role while maintaining the boundaries of their arrangement. That night, as a maid helped her prepare for bed in her new chambers, spacious, elegantly appointed, and notably separate from the Baron's, Marianne caught her reflection in the dressing table mirror. The same face looked back at her, but the context had utterly changed. No longer Miss Elcott the governess, dependent on the goodwill of her employer, now Lady Redstone, mistress of this great house. Yet as she dismissed the maid and sat alone in the unfamiliar room, she felt more vulnerable than ever. She had traded one form of precariousness for another. As governess, her position had been humble but defined. As baroness in a marriage of convenience, she occupied a nebulous space. Neither truly wife nor merely employee. Tomorrow, she would need to navigate this new reality. Directing servants who had once been her superiors in the household hierarchy, mothering children she had taught, but never tucked into bed, and sharing a home, but not a life with the reserved man who was now her husband. The knock came just as the hall clock struck 11. Marianne, seated at the dressing table in her nightgown and robe, stiffened. She had been brushing her hair, 100 strokes, a nightly ritual since girlhood, and had reached only 63. "Enter," she called, setting down the brush with a hand that trembled only slightly. Hugh appeared in the doorway, still fully dressed save for his jacket and cravat. The top button of his shirt was undone, revealing a glimpse of his throat. He hesitated on the threshold, as if uncertain of his welcome in this room that was technically his own. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said formally. "Not at all." Marianne rose, tightening the sash of her robe. "I was just preparing for bed." He nodded, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. For the first time, Marianne truly looked at the bridal chamber that had been prepared for them. Someone, Mrs. Winters perhaps, had arranged it with traditional care. Fresh candles burned in silver holders. The bed covers had been turned down invitingly, and across the white linen sheets, a scattering of deep red rose petals formed a deliberate path. The sight of those petals, so at odds with the practical nature of their arrangement, made something twist inside Marianne's chest. A mockery of romance for a marriage built on convenience. Hugh followed her gaze, and something flickered across his face. Discomfort, perhaps, or regret. "I should have spoken to you earlier about expectations," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I realize this situation is unconventional." Marianne clasped her hands at her waist. "I understand my duties, my lord." "Hugh," he corrected quietly, "at least when we are alone." "Hugh," she repeated, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. He moved further into the room, stopping near the foot of the bed. The candlelight cast half his face in shadow, softening the stern lines around his mouth. "Marriage carries certain obligations," he continued, his fingers moving to the next button of his shirt. "Legal requirements for validity." Marianne swallowed. She was no naive girl. At 35, she understood what was expected on a wedding night. She had prepared herself for this, a dutiful, dispassionate consummation that would seal their contract. "I am aware," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Hugh undid another button, then another, his movements deliberate. Marianne stood very still, watching him, waiting. The petals on the bed seemed to glow accusingly in the candlelight. Then unexpectedly, Hugh's hand stilled. He looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps seeing the resignation in her posture, the careful way she held herself. Something changed in his expression. With a decisive movement, he rebuttoned his shirt, working his way back up to his collar. "There are legal requirements," he said quietly, "but there is also respect." He moved to the bed, and in one smooth motion, gathered the edge of the sheet and lifted it, sending rose petals cascading to the floor. He swept them aside with his hand, clearing the bed of their romantic pretense. Marianne watched, confused. "I don't understand." Hugh straightened, his expression grave, but gentler than she had ever seen it. "I proposed this marriage for practical reasons, but I won't treat you as merely a convenience." He crossed to where she stood, and with unexpected gentleness, picked up his dressing gown that had been laid out across a chair. He placed it around her shoulders, over her own thin robe, adding a layer of warmth and protection. "You have my name now and my protection," he said. "You need not give me your body out of duty." Relief and something more complex washed over Marianne. "But the marriage can be formalized when, if you are ready." He stepped back, creating space between them. "I'll sleep in the adjoining dressing room tonight. Tomorrow, we can discuss more permanent arrangements." Marianne clutched the edges of his dressing gown, enveloped in its warmth and the faint scent of sandalwood that clung to the fabric. "You would allow this?" "It's not a matter of allowing," Hugh replied. "It's a matter of respect. You've given up your independence to secure my children's well-being. I won't demand more than you've agreed to give." He moved toward the connecting door, then paused. "Good night, Marianne." "Good night, Hugh," she answered, the name still strange on her lips. After he had gone, Marianne sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by fallen rose petals. She had expected cold duty tonight. Instead, she had received an unexpected gift: dignity. It was, perhaps, worth more than any passion. Breakfast became their first shared ritual. Each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, Marianne would enter the morning room to find Hugh already seated, the newspaper folded beside his plate. He would rise at her entrance, a courtesy he had never shown the governess, but unfailingly extended to the Baroness. "Good morning," he would say, waiting until she took her seat before resuming his own. "Good morning," she would reply, accepting the tea he poured for her. Their conversations remained largely practical. The children's progress, household matters, occasional estate business that might affect the family schedule. Yet in these daily exchanges, Marianne began to glimpse the methodical mind behind Hugh's reserved exterior. He listened to her suggestions about the children's education with genuine consideration. When she proposed rearranging the library to create a better study area, he not only approved, but offered his own ideas. The staff watched this developing dynamic with varying reactions. Mrs. Winters maintained a rigid formality that emphasized Marianne's former position rather than her current one. "As you wish, my lady," she would say, with just enough inflection to suggest the title was ill-fitting. The younger servants, however, seemed relieved by Marianne's gentle direction, so different from the housekeeper's stern management. "The East Wing sitting room needs fresh flowers, Sarah," Marianne instructed a maid one morning. "And perhaps the blue vase rather than the crystal." "Yes, my lady," the girl replied, and Marianne caught the hint of a genuine smile, the first directed at her since the wedding. With the children, Marianne navigated a delicate balance. Lessons continued as before, but now there were new dimensions to their relationship. The first time Catherine called her mother instead of Miss Elcott, Marianne felt both touched and terrified by the responsibility the word carried. "You may call me whatever makes you comfortable," she told the girls that evening as she read them their bedtime story, a task that had once been merely educational, but now felt intimately maternal. "Father says you're our mother now," Eleanor said, her small face serious in the lamplight, "but also still our teacher." "Your father is right," Marianne said carefully. "I am both." Hugh himself remained a puzzle. During the day, he was cordial, attentive to her needs as mistress of the house, but carefully maintaining the boundaries they had established. Each night, he would escort her to her door after their quiet hour in the drawing room, bow formally, and retire to his own chambers at the opposite end of the corridor. Yet occasionally Marianne would catch him watch expression she couldn't decipher. Not desire exactly, but something more complex. Once when she laughed at something Eleanor said, she looked up to find his eyes on her, a startled softness in them that vanished the moment he realized she had noticed. 3 weeks after their wedding, Hugh's aunt arrived unannounced from London, bringing with her the sharp scrutiny of family judgment. "A most unusual arrangement," Lady Agatha remarked during tea, her eyes moving deliberately between Hugh and Marianne. "Though I suppose it serves its purpose." "Marianne has been an excellent influence on the children," Hugh replied evenly. "Indeed." The older woman's gaze lingered on Marianne. "And when might we expect a new addition to the family? A son would secure the succession, after all." The question hung in the air, like a thrown gauntlet. Marianne felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her expression composed. "Such matters are private, Aunt," Hugh said, his voice carrying a rare edge. Lady Agatha smiled thinly. "Not when they concern the Redstone lineage, my dear nephew." That night, for the first time since their wedding, an uncomfortable silence fell between them in the drawing room. Hugh stared into the fire, his profile rigid with tension. Marianne pretended to focus on her embroidery, though her needle remained motionless above the fabric. "I apologize for my aunt's impertinence," Hugh finally said. "There's no need," Marianne replied, setting aside her needlework. "It's a natural question, given the circumstances." Hugh's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. Nevertheless, she had no right to raise such matters. Marianne studied him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he avoided her gaze. "The question will arise again," she said softly, "from others if not from her." "Yes," he agreed, still looking into the fire rather than at her. "I suppose it will." The clock chimed 10, and Hugh rose, their customary signal that the evening had ended. As always, he escorted her to her door, bowed, and bid her good night. But that night, as Marianne prepared for bed alone, she felt the first real stirrings of discontent with their careful arrangement. January brought heavy snow that blanketed Redstone Hall in pristine white. The world beyond the windows seemed hushed, and within the house, life settled into rhythms that were no longer entirely uncomfortable. Marianne found herself watching Hugh when he wasn't aware. The careful way he listened to his daughters recount their lessons, how his hand sometimes hovered protectively near Eleanor's back when they walked downstairs, the slight softening around his eyes when Catherine played the pianoforte. These were not the actions of a cold man, but of one who carried his affections cautiously, as if afraid they might shatter if held too openly. One evening, as snow tapped gently against the windows, Marianne sat in the library selecting books for the children's next lessons. The door opened quietly, and Hugh entered, pausing when he saw her. "I apologize for disturbing you," he said. "I came for the estate ledgers." "You're not disturbing me." Marianne smiled slightly. "It's your library, after all." "Our library," he corrected, moving to the shelves that housed the estate records. The simple word, "our," hung in the air between them, acknowledging the strange reality they had created. A marriage that was both real and not. A shared life, kept carefully partitioned. Hugh selected a leather-bound volume, but didn't immediately leave. Instead, he glanced at the books Marianne had spread across the table. "Natural philosophy, for Catherine." Marianne nodded. "She has an aptitude for it. I thought we might begin simple experiments." "Her mother enjoyed such things," Hugh said quietly, then looked as if he regretted the words. It was the first time he had voluntarily mentioned his first wife. Marianne treaded carefully. "Catherine has her curiosity, then." Hugh's fingers traced the spine of the ledger he held. "Yes, among other qualities." He hesitated, then added, "Eleanor has her gentleness." Marianne sensed the opening, slight as it was. "They're fortunate to have those pieces of her." "And fortunate to have your guidance now." His eyes met hers briefly, then returned to the ledger. "You've been good for them." Before Marianne could respond, he nodded formally and left, the moment of connection as fleeting as it was unexpected. Such moments accumulated slowly. A shared smile when Eleanor mispronounced a difficult word. Their hands briefly touching as they both reached for the same book. Standing side by side at the window, watching the children build a snow castle in the garden below. None of these moments were remarkable in themselves. Yet together they formed a pattern of growing familiarity that neither acknowledged aloud. The staff noticed. Marianne overheard Mrs. Winters speaking to the butler one afternoon, their voices carrying from the pantry as she passed. "Married nearly a month and still separate chambers," the housekeeper said. "It's not natural." "Not our place to judge, Mrs. Winters," the butler replied. "It is when the future of the estate hangs in the balance. No heir means the entail passes to that wastrel cousin in London." Marianne slipped away, her cheeks burning. That evening she found it difficult to meet Hugh's eyes across the dinner table, knowing the household speculated about the most intimate aspects of their arrangement. After the children were asleep, Marianne wandered to the gallery, where portraits of Redstone ancestors lined the walls. At the end hung a painting of a beautiful young woman with Catherine's serious eyes and Eleanor's delicate mouth, the First Lady Redstone. She was 26 when that was painted. Hugh's voice came from behind her. "A year before she died." Marianne turned, startled. Hugh stood in the doorway, his face half in shadow. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude on private memories." "You're not intruding." He moved to stand beside her, looking up at the portrait. "Elizabeth would have approved of you, I think. She valued honesty and kindness above all." The compliment, unexpected and sincere, warmed something in Marianne's chest. "She gave you beautiful daughters." "Yes." His voice held a complexity of emotion. "She did." They stood in silence, the painted eyes of the First Lady Redstone gazing down at them. Finally, Hugh spoke again, his voice so low Marianne had to lean slightly closer to hear. "The staff talk," he said. "About our arrangement." Marianne's breath caught. "Yes. Does it trouble you?" "What they say?" She considered the question carefully. "Not for myself. But I worry that such talk might eventually reach the children." Hugh nodded, his profile grave in the dim light. A valid concern. Another silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken possibilities. "Good night, Marianne," he finally said, his voice gentle. "Good night, Hugh," she replied, watching as he walked away, his shoulders carrying a weight she was beginning to understand, though its exact nature remained a mystery. The scream tore through the midnight silence of Redstone Hall, jerking Marianne from sleep. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't place the sound. Then it came again. High, frightened, unmistakably Eleanor's voice. Marianne was moving before conscious thought, flinging back the covers and grabbing her robe. She rushed into the corridor, nearly colliding with Hugh, who had emerged from his chambers at the same moment. "Eleanor," they said in unison, and without discussion, hurried toward the children's wing. They found Catherine standing anxiously in the doorway of her sister's room, her nightgown ghostly in the darkness. "She's burning hot," the older girl said, her voice trembling. "I tried to wake her, but she only cries." Hugh pushed past her, and Marianne followed. Eleanor lay tangled in her bedsheets, her small face flushed crimson, eyes glassy with fever. When Hugh touched her forehead, she whimpered and turned away. "We need cold compresses," Marianne said, taking charge. "And Willow. Bark tea. Go wake Mrs. Winters and ask her to send for the doctor." The girl nodded and ran. Hugh stood frozen beside the bed, his face a mask of barely controlled fear as he looked down at his younger daughter. "Hugh," Marianne said gently. When he didn't respond, she touched his arm. "Hugh, help me move her to the center of the bed." The physical task seemed to break his paralysis. Together, they repositioned Eleanor, whose skin burned against Marianne's hands. The child's breathing was rapid and shallow, her nightgown soaked with sweat. "I'll get water for compresses," Hugh said, his voice rough. Alone with Eleanor, Marianne spoke softly, comfortingly, as she untangled the bedclothes and loosened the child's nightgown. "You'll be all right, my darling. We're here with you. Your father and I are right here." Hugh returned with a basin of water and cloths. His hands shook slightly as he wrung out the first compress and placed it on Eleanor's forehead. The little girl moaned, turning her head restlessly. "She's so hot," he said, and Marianne heard the fear beneath his controlled tone. "The fever is trying to fight whatever is making her ill," Marianne explained, taking another cloth and gently bathing the child's arms and legs. "We need to help it do its work without letting her get too hot." Mrs. Winters arrived with the willow bark tea, her gray hair in a hasty braid. "The boy is gone for Dr. Morris," she reported, "though with the snow, it may be some time before he arrives." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Marianne said. "Would you sit with Catherine? She's frightened." The housekeeper nodded and withdrew. Marianne turned her attention to coaxing sips of the bitter tea between Eleanor's parched lips. Through the long hours that followed, Marianne and Hugh worked in tandem, changing compresses, monitoring Eleanor's breathing, speaking gentle reassurances. When she stirred in feverish confusion, outside, the night pressed dark against the windows, snow continuing to fall in the silent world beyond their urgent vigil. "She called for Elizabeth once," Hugh said suddenly, his voice low. "Did you hear it?" Marianne, refreshing a compress, looked up at him. Children often call for their mothers when they're ill. She barely remembers Elizabeth. His hands, capable and strong in daily life, looked lost as they hovered over his daughter's small form. She was only 3 when... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "She remembers love," Marianne said softly. "That's what matters." Hugh met her eyes across the bed, and in that moment, the careful distance he maintained seemed to crumble. Marianne saw naked fear in his face, not the controlled concern of a baron, but the raw terror of a father who had already lost too much. I cannot lose her, he whispered. Marianne reached across Eleanor and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with desperate strength. You won't, she promised. We won't. They remained that way, hands clasped above the feverish child, until Eleanor stirred again, her eyes opening slightly. Thirsty. Together they raised her, Hugh supporting her back while Marianne held the cup to her lips. Eleanor drank, then leaned heavily against her father's chest. His arms encircled her with infinite gentleness, and over the child's head, his eyes met Marianne's, grateful, vulnerable, stripped of pretense. The night crept toward dawn. Eleanor's fever began to ease, her breathing growing deeper and more regular. When Dr. Morris finally arrived, stomping snow from his boots, the crisis had largely passed. Influenza, most likely, he pronounced after examining her. She's through the worst of it. Keep her warm, plenty of fluids, and she should recover fully. Relief made Marianne's knees weak. Hugh thanked the doctor with grave courtesy, but when the man had gone, he sank into the chair beside Eleanor's bed, his face in his hands. Marianne touched his shoulder gently. She'll be all right. He looked up, and in the gray light of dawn, his face showed everything he usually kept hidden: exhaustion, relief, and something deeper that made Marianne's heart beat faster. Because of you, he said quietly. I couldn't. When I saw her like that, I couldn't think, couldn't act. You were here, Marianne said. That's what mattered to her. Hugh covered her hand with his own. And you were here. That's what mattered to me. In the pale morning light, with a sleeping child between them, something fundamental shifted in the careful architecture of their arrangement. The week following Eleanor's illness brought a subtle change to Redstone Hall. Hugh began joining Marianne and the children for afternoon lessons, ostensibly to monitor Eleanor's recovery, but remaining even after the little girl was clearly improving. In the evenings, their conversations in the drawing room grew longer, extending beyond practical matters to books they had read, music they enjoyed, memories of their respective childhoods. Yet alongside this newfound ease, an undercurrent of tension had emerged. Lady Agatha's visit had stirred talk in the household and beyond. Twice the vicar's wife had made pointed inquiries about Marianne's health during Sunday services. The cook had been overheard speculating about preparing special foods for when her ladyship's condition requires it. Marianne felt the weight of these expectations like a physical pressure. Their marriage, begun as a practical solution, now carried the burden of dynastic concerns that neither had openly addressed. One evening in late January, as they sat before the drawing room fire, Hugh broke their comfortable silence. My solicitor visited today. Marianne looked up from her book. Is everything all right? Quite. Hugh hesitated. He brought papers regarding the entail, matters that would need attention should we have a son. The directness of the statement hung in the air between them. Marianne closed her book carefully, marking her place with a ribbon. I see, she said, her voice steady despite the sudden racing of her heart. I told him such discussions were premature. Hugh's fingers tapped restlessly against the arm of his chair. He disagreed. Marianne gathered her courage. Perhaps it's time we spoke openly about this aspect of our arrangement. Hugh's expression tightened, but he nodded. Perhaps it is. Marianne rose and moved to the window, needing distance for what she was about to say. Outside, moonlight silvered the snow-covered gardens, beautiful and cold. I've been thinking, she began, about our situation, about what would be best for everyone concerned. Go on, Hugh said quietly. She turned to face him. We entered this marriage for specific reasons, to silence rumors, to provide stability for the children, to secure my position. Those needs have been met. Hugh watched her, his face unreadable. Perhaps, Marianne continued carefully, we might formalize a different arrangement. I could move to the West Wing. We could continue as we are in most respects. I would raise the girls, manage the household, maintain appearances publicly, but privately. We would acknowledge that certain expectations of marriage need not apply. You're suggesting we live entirely as partners in name only. Hugh's voice was controlled, revealing nothing of his thoughts. It would end the speculation, Marianne said. Over time, people would accept that there would be no heir of our union. The entail would pass as it would have if you had remained unmarried. Hugh rose abruptly and walked to the fireplace, his back to her. The silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken emotions. "Is that what you want?" he finally asked, still facing the fire. Marianne hesitated. Was it? The question forced her to examine feelings she had carefully avoided. "I want," she said slowly, "not to be a duty, not to be a means to an end. If we were to truly be husband and wife, I would want it to be a choice made from mutual regard, not obligation." Hugh turned, and the raw emotion on his face startled her. "Do you think obligation is all I feel for you?" "I don't know what you feel," Marianne admitted. "You've been kind, considerate, but always so careful, so contained." Hugh's laugh held no humor. Contained. Yes, I suppose that's the word. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of discomposure. "There are things you don't know, Marianne, things I haven't told you." "Then tell me now," she said quietly. Hugh looked at her for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Elizabeth died in childbirth," he said, his voice rough. "The child, a boy, died with her." Marianne's heart contracted. "Hugh, I'm so sorry. It was my fault," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "I wanted an heir. The doctors warned that another pregnancy would be dangerous after Eleanor. But I convinced her we should try again." The self-recrimination in his voice was unbearable. Marianne moved toward him, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "When I found you with Eleanor that night, during her fever, do you know what I remembered?" His eyes held hers, intense with memory. "A night 3 years ago, when both girls were ill. I couldn't enter the nursery. I stood outside the door, listening to them cry, paralyzed by the memory of Elizabeth's last hours. And then I heard your voice. You were singing to them, so softly, by morning. They were better." Marianne remembered that night, how she'd sat between the small beds, singing lullabies until her voice grew hoarse, never knowing Hugh had been just outside. "That's why you chose me," she whispered, "not just for propriety's sake. I chose you because you were strong where I was weak," Hugh said. "Because you loved my children when I couldn't even face them. Because you brought light back to this house when I had resigned myself to darkness." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his brown eyes. "But I never intended to trap you in a marriage without love. If you wish to live separately, I will respect that. If you wish to leave Redstone entirely, I will provide for you generously. You have earned your freedom, Marianne, many times over." Marianne looked up at this man she had married, this complex, wounded, honorable man, and recognized the truth of her own heart. "And if I wish to stay," she asked softly, "not as your partner in name only, but as your true wife?" Hugh's breath caught. "Is that what you want?" "Yes," Marianne said simply. "It is." February brought a gradual thaw to the grounds of Redstone Hall. Icicles that had hung from the eaves for weeks began to drip in the strengthening sun. In the gardens, the first brave crocuses pushed through the retreating snow, dots of purple and yellow against the dark earth. Inside, a different kind of thawing was taking place. It began with small gestures. Hugh's hand at Marianne's elbow as they walked down the stairs. Marianne's fingers brushing his as she passed him the morning paper. Conversations that continued long after the children had gone to bed, moving from books and music to deeper matters. Regrets, quiet dreams, they had each thought long abandoned. "I always wanted to travel," Marianne confessed one evening, "to see the great art collections of Florence, the ruins of Rome." Hugh looked at her with interest. "We could go, when the children are a bit older, make a grand tour of it." The word held a world of meaning. "Yes, we." Hugh's smile, once so rare, came more easily now. "I find I'm no longer content to imagine you experiencing such wonders without me by your side." The household noticed the change. Mrs. Winters pinched disapproval, softened as she observed her master and mistress lingering over breakfast. Heads bent close in conversation. The younger servants exchanged knowing glances when the Baron and Baroness were discovered in the library, standing unnecessarily close as they examined a volume of botanical illustrations. Even the children sensed the shift. Catherine, observant as always, remarked one afternoon, "Father laughs more now." "Does he?" Marianne asked, helping the girl with her French translation. "Yes." Catherine looked up, her serious eyes thoughtful. And he looks at you differently. How does he look at me? Marianne couldn't help asking. Catherine considered this gravely. Like you're a present he didn't expect to receive. That night, Hugh escorted Marianne to her chamber as usual, but instead of the formal bow that had once marked their nightly parting, he took her hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "about what you said, about choices made from mutual regard, not obligation." Marianne's pulse quickened. "Yes. I wonder if you might join me for a walk tomorrow, just the two of us. There's a place on the estate I'd like to show you." It was such a simple invitation, yet it represented something profound, not a duty of their positions, but a desire for her company alone. "I'd like that very much," she replied. Hugh raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture both courtly and intimate. "Until tomorrow, then." The following afternoon found them walking along a path that wound through a small wood on the eastern edge of the estate. The air held the crisp promise of spring, and patches of sunlight dappled the ground through the bare branches above. "It's just ahead," Hugh said, guiding her around a bend in the path. They emerged into a clearing where a small stone folly stood, its classical columns weathered by time, but still elegant. Before it spread a view of the valley below, with Redstone Hall visible in the distance, its windows catching the afternoon light. "Elizabeth designed it," Hugh said quietly. "A place of solitude and contemplation," she called it. Marianne hesitated. "Should I not be here then?" Hugh took her hand firmly in his. "That's precisely why I brought you. For years, I've kept her memory separate from my present life, as if honoring her meant never moving forward. I see now how wrong that was." He led her to a stone bench within the folly. As they sat, his arm came around her shoulders naturally, as if it had always belonged there. "I want to build something new, Marianne, not forgetting the past, but not imprisoned by it either." His eyes, warm and direct, held hers. "I want to build it with you." "I want that too," she whispered. His kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, a question, an offering. Marianne answered by drawing closer, her hand coming to rest against his chest, where she could feel the steady beating of his heart. Later, as they walked back to the house hand in hand, Hugh spoke of practical matters, moving his belongings to her chambers, or perhaps both of them taking new rooms together. A fresh start. Marianne listened, offering her thoughts, marveling at how natural it felt to plan a shared life. As they approached Redstone Hall, they saw Catherine and Eleanor waiting on the front steps, waving excitedly. Without discussion, Hugh and Marianne each held out a hand as they reached the children. Eleanor took Marianne's, Catherine took Hugh's, and together they ascended the stairs, a family united not by obligation but by choice. Behind them, the door to the house stood open, welcoming them into a future. None of them could have imagined that December day, when a practical proposal had set their story in motion. Inside, the afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating the hallway where they stood together. 4 hands joined in the light, shadows no longer separate but intertwined. And upstairs, at the end of the east corridor, a bedroom door stood half open, no longer a barrier, but a threshold to a life where intimacy was no longer feared, but embraced as the natural expression of a love that had grown quietly, steadily, from the most unexpected of beginnings.